The sharp crack of whispers cut through the crowded mercantile like a knife as Pearl Owens reached for a bolt of fabric on the top shelf. Standing on tiptoes, her curves strained against the seams of her dress, and the whispers grew louder. "Lord Almighty, she's busting out of that dress like dough from a tin," a woman's voice hissed, followed by muffled laughter. Pearl's cheeks burned as her fingers closed around the blue cotton, but she held her head high, refusing to let them see how deeply their words cut. Silver Creek, Colorado, 1885, was supposed to be a fresh start after the death of her parents back east. At 22, Pearl had inherited enough money to make the journey west and purchase a small cottage on the edge of town, where she planned to establish a dressmaking business. But 3 months in, she was still that big Eastern girl who didn't quite fit in literally, according to the town gossips. "Need some help with that, Miss Owens?" Mr. Finley, the mercantile owner, asked kindly. "I've got it, thank you," Pearl replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She placed the fabric on the counter, along with thread and buttons from her basket. As Mr. Finley tallied her purchases, the bell above the door jingled. A hush fell over the store as heavy boots thudded across the wooden floor. "Afternoon, Hayes," Mr. Finley called, and Pearl turned slightly to see the newcomer. Hayes Xavier stood well over 6 feet tall, his broad shoulders filling the doorframe. His face was tanned and weathered from long days working his cattle ranch outside of town. At 28, he was considered one of the most eligible bachelors in Silver Creek, though he rarely came to town except for supplies and the occasional social gathering. "Mr. Finley," Hayes nodded, removing his hat to reveal dark brown hair that curled slightly at the ends. His eyes, a startling blue, briefly met Pearl's before she looked away. "I'll have your order ready in a minute," Mr. Finley said, finishing up with Pearl's purchase. "Just need to help Miss Owens here first." Pearl gathered her parcels quickly, eager to escape the mercantile and the whispers that had started up again. As she turned to leave, her elbow knocked a display of canned goods, sending several tins clattering to the floor. "Clumsy as well as oversized," a woman murmured loudly enough for everyone to hear. It was Beatrice Miller, the banker's wife and self-appointed arbiter of Silver Creek's social standards. Pearl froze, her face flaming as she bent to retrieve the fallen items, but strong hands were already there, gathering the tins. "No harm done," Hayes said, his deep voice rumbling as he straightened and replaced the cans on the shelf. "These displays are always put too close to the counter anyway." Pearl couldn't meet his eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Xavier." "Hayes," he corrected with a small smile that transformed his rugged features. She nodded and hurried out, the bell jingling behind her as she stepped onto the boardwalk. The late summer sun beat down on her as she clutched her packages and headed toward home, fighting back tears that threatened to spill. Behind her, she heard the door open again and quick footsteps. "Miss Owens." Pearl turned to find Hayes Xavier following her, his hat back on his head, shading his face. "You forgot this," he said, holding out a small paper package of pins. "Oh, thank you." Their fingers brushed as she took the package, and she noticed how large his hands were, calloused from ranch work. "I'm headed your way if you'd like a ride," he offered, gesturing to a wagon hitched nearby. "Those packages look heavy." Pearl hesitated. She wasn't used to kindness from strangers, especially handsome men. "I wouldn't want to impose." "No imposition. I need to deliver some things to Mrs. Beckett, and her place is just past yours." Pearl considered her aching feet and the mile walk home. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Hayes." He loaded her purchases into the wagon and offered his hand to help her up. Once settled beside him, Pearl became acutely aware of how much space she took up on the seat, and she pressed herself against the side of the wagon. Hayes flicked the reins and the horses started forward. "You're the dressmaker, right? Just moved here from back east." "Yes," Pearl replied. "Though business has been slower than I'd hoped." Hayes nodded. "Takes time for folks around here to warm up to newcomers. Once they see your work, I'm sure you'll be plenty busy." They rode in companionable silence for a few minutes before Hayes spoke again. "Don't pay Beatrice Miller any mind. She's had a sharp tongue since we were kids." Pearl stiffened. "I don't know what you mean." Hayes gave her a sideways glance. "I heard what she said in the store. She's wrong, you know." Pearl's throat tightened. "It's fine, I'm used to it." "Well, you shouldn't have to be," he said firmly. When they reached Pearl's small cottage, Hayes helped her down from the wagon and carried her packages to the door. "Thank you for the ride," Pearl said, fumbling for her key. "My pleasure, Miss Owens." Hayes shifted his weight, seeming hesitant. "My sister's getting married next month. She might be interested in having a dress made if you're taking orders." Pearl brightened. "I'd be delighted to help with your sister's wedding dress." "Good," Hayes said with a nod. "I'll tell her to call on you then." He tipped his hat and turned to go, then paused. "Oh, and Miss Owens." "Yes." "There's a town social next Saturday evening. Will you be attending?" Pearl's smile faltered. Her experiences at town gatherings had been less than pleasant. "I hadn't planned on it." "You should consider it. Might help drum up business." With another tip of his hat, he returned to his wagon and drove away. Pearl watched him go, a small flutter of something like hope warming her chest. The following Tuesday, Hayes's sister Martha arrived at Pearl's cottage, full of excitement about her upcoming wedding. Unlike many of the townspeople, Martha was warm and friendly, exclaiming over Pearl's sample designs and fabric selections. "Hayes said you were talented, but these are beautiful." Martha ran her fingers over a detailed embroidery sample. "I've been so worried about finding something nice for the wedding. The dressmaker in Fairfield retired last month, and I didn't want to settle for something ordinary." "Your brother mentioned the wedding," Pearl said, sketching as Martha described what she envisioned. "He seems kind." Martha smiled. "Hayes has always been the best of men, even when our parents died and he took over the ranch at just 20. Had to grow up fast, but never lost his good heart." She studied Pearl curiously. "He doesn't usually go out of his way to recommend services, though." "He must have been impressed with your work." Pearl felt her cheeks warm. "I don't think he's seen my work. We only just met at the mercantile." Martha said with a knowing smile. "Interesting." By the time Martha left, Pearl had measurements, design approval, and a substantial deposit for what would be the most important dress she'd made since arriving in Silver Creek. The prospect of creating Martha's wedding gown lifted her spirits considerably, and for the first time, she began to think seriously about attending the town social. Saturday arrived clear and warm. Pearl spent the morning putting finishing touches on Martha's wedding dress design before turning her attention to her own appearance for the social. Her wardrobe was limited. Most of her funds had gone toward her business, but she had one good dress that she'd made herself, a deep green that complemented her auburn hair and fair skin. As she dressed, Pearl studied her reflection in the mirror. She was tall for a woman, with generous curves that had been the subject of ridicule since adolescence. In Philadelphia, she'd learned to make her own clothes when ready-made ones never fit properly. It was what had led her to dressmaking in the first place. Her hands smoothed the fabric over her hips. The dress fit well, she'd made sure of that, but she couldn't help wondering if it would be enough to stave off the critical eyes of Silver Creek's women. "It doesn't matter," she told her reflection firmly. "You're going for the business, not for them." The social was held in the town hall, a large building that served multiple purposes in Silver Creek. When Pearl arrived, lanterns were lit, casting a warm glow over tables laden with food and a cleared space for dancing. A small band was setting up in the corner, and children darted between adults who stood in clusters, chatting. Pearl took a deep breath and stepped inside. A few heads turned, and she heard the familiar whispers start up, but she kept her chin high and moved toward the refreshment table. "Miss Owens, you came." Martha appeared at her elbow, beaming. "I'm so glad. Come meet my fiancé, Daniel." Grateful for the friendly face, Pearl allowed herself to be led to a group that included a pleasant-looking man who was introduced as Daniel Cooper. As they chatted about wedding plans, Pearl began to relax slightly. Martha seemed genuinely pleased to introduce her to others as the talented dressmaker making my wedding gown. It was nearly an hour later when Pearl felt a presence beside her as she stood near the refreshment table. "You decided to come after all," Hayes said, his voice warm. Pearl turned, surprised at the flutter in her stomach at the sight of him. He was dressed in clean dark pants, a white shirt, and a vest, his usual cowboy hat absent. "Your sister was very persuasive about the business opportunities," Pearl replied with a small smile. "Martha tends to get her way," Hayes agreed, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Are you enjoying yourself?" Pearl hesitated. "It's nice to see the community together." Hayes studied her for a moment. "That's not what I asked," Pearl sighed. "I'm trying to, but I don't exactly fit in here." Before Hayes could respond, the band struck up a lively tune and couples began moving toward the dance floor. "Would you care to dance, Miss Owens?" Hayes asked suddenly, offering his hand. Pearl stared at him, certain she'd misheard. I don't think that's a good idea." "Why not? I'm not very graceful," she admitted, "and people are already staring." Hayes looked around the room, his jaw tightening as he noticed the glances in their direction. "Let them stare. I'm asking you to dance because I want to dance with you, not because I care what they think." Something in his direct gaze gave Pearl courage. She placed her hand in his. "All right, but I warned you about my dancing." Hayes led her to the dance floor, and as they took their positions, Pearl was acutely aware of the whispers around them. Beatrice Miller's voice carried clearly. "Poor Hayes having to dance with her. She'll probably crush his toes." Pearl stiffened, but Hayes's hand tightened on hers. "Eyes on me," he said quietly. "No one else matters right now." As they moved to the music, Pearl was surprised to find that, with Hayes leading, she didn't feel clumsy at all. His hand was warm and steady at her waist, and he guided her confidently through the steps. "See, you're a natural," he said, spinning her carefully. "Only because you're making me look good," Pearl replied, a genuine smile spreading across her face. "You don't need my help for that," Hayes said, his eyes holding hers. "That dress is beautiful. Did you make it yourself?" Pearl nodded. "I make all my clothes." "You've got a gift, then. The color suits you perfectly." The music ended too soon, and Hayes led her back to the edge of the dance floor. "Thank you for the dance, Miss Owens." "Pearl," she corrected, feeling brave. "If I'm to call you Hayes." "Pearl," he repeated, and somehow her name sounded different when he said it. The evening progressed, and to Pearl's surprise, Hayes sought her out for 2 more dances. Between dances, he introduced her to several ranchers' wives who expressed interest in having dresses made. As the social wound down, Pearl found herself actually disappointed that the evening was ending. She was gathering her shawl when Beatrice Miller approached, her smile tight and false. "Miss Owens, what an interesting dress you're wearing tonight. Did you have to use extra fabric to accommodate your figure?" Her voice dripped with false concern. Pearl felt her face grow hot, but before she could respond, Hayes appeared beside her. "Evening, Beatrice," he said, his tone cool. "Pearl was just telling me she designed this dress herself. Shows real talent, doesn't it?" Several of the ladies have already commissioned her for new dresses. Beatrice's smile faltered. Well, I suppose some people need specialized tailoring. We all benefit from clothes that fit properly, Hayes replied evenly. Pearl has a gift for making people look their best. He turned to Pearl. May I walk you home? It's getting dark. Grateful for his intervention, Pearl nodded. Thank you, that would be lovely. Beatrice's mouth pinched into a thin line as Hayes offered Pearl his arm and led her out of the town hall. The night air was cool after the warmth of the hall, and Pearl pulled her shawl closer around her shoulders. The stars were bright overhead as they walked in silence for a few moments. You didn't have to do that, Pearl finally said. Do what? Stand up for me to Beatrice, or dance with me, or any of it, really. Hayes stopped walking and turned to face her. I didn't do anything I didn't want to do, Pearl. Beatrice Miller has been using her position to bully others since we were children, and it's about time someone called her on it. It's kind of you to say, but... Pearl sighed. She's not wrong. I am bigger than most women. I take up more space. It's been pointed out to me my whole life. Hayes was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful in the moonlight. Can I tell you something? Pearl nodded. When I first saw you in the mercantile, I didn't think there's a woman who takes up too much space. I thought there's a woman who looks real, not like those porcelain dolls that break if you touch them. He ran a hand through his hair, looking slightly embarrassed. I'm not good with words, but there's nothing wrong with the way you look, Pearl, not a single thing. Pearl felt tears prick her eyes and she blinked rapidly. No one had ever spoken to her like that before. Thank you, she whispered. They resumed walking, and when they reached Pearl's cottage, Hayes waited as she unlocked her door. I had a nice time tonight, she said, turning back to him. So did I. Hayes seemed to be debating something. Would it be all right if I called on you sometime? Maybe Sunday after church? Pearl's heart raced. I'd like that. Good. His smile was warm in the darkness. Good night, Pearl. Good night, Hayes. Inside her cottage, Pearl leaned against the closed door, her mind spinning with the events of the evening. For the first time since arriving in Silver Creek, she felt like perhaps she could belong here after all. True to his word, Hayes arrived at Pearl's cottage the following Sunday afternoon. He'd clearly come straight from church, dressed in his best clothes, hat in hand. I thought we might take a walk, he suggested. The weather's fine and there's a nice view from the hill just past town. Pearl agreed, and they set off at a leisurely pace. As they walked, Hayes told her about his ranch, the challenges and rewards of raising cattle in Colorado's sometimes harsh conditions. It's not always easy, he admitted, but there's something about building something with your own hands that makes it worthwhile. I understand that, Pearl said. It's how I feel about dressmaking, creating something beautiful that didn't exist before, Hayes nodded. Martha showed me your designs for her wedding dress. She's over the moon about it. I'm glad. She's been wonderful to work with. They reached the top of the hill, where a large oak tree provided shade. The view stretched out before them, the small town of Silver Creek nestled in the valley, surrounded by rolling grasslands and distant mountains. It's beautiful, Pearl breathed. This is my favorite spot to think, Hayes said, settling on the grass and inviting Pearl to join him. When things get overwhelming at the ranch, I come up here to remind myself why I do it. Pearl sat carefully beside him, arranging her skirts. And why do you do it? Hayes gestured toward the landscape. For this, for the land. My father used to say that we don't really own the land, we're just taking care of it for those who come after us. They talked for hours, sharing stories of their childhoods, Hayes growing up on the ranch, Pearl in Philadelphia with parents who encouraged her creativity despite society's narrow views on appropriate pursuits for young ladies. My mother taught me to sew, Pearl explained. but it was my father who encouraged me to turn it into a business. He said talent was a gift meant to be shared, not hidden away. Your father sounds like a wise man, Hayes said. He was. Pearl's smile turned sad. I miss them both terribly. The influenza took them both last winter within days of each other. Hayes's hand covered hers briefly. I'm sorry, I know how that feels. As the sun began to set, they reluctantly made their way back to town. At Pearl's door, Hayes lingered. Would you allow me to call on you again? He asked. Pearl smiled. I'd be disappointed if you didn't. Over the next few weeks, Hayes became a regular visitor at Pearl's cottage. Sometimes they walked, sometimes they simply sat on her small porch and talked. Occasionally, he brought small gifts, wildflowers, a book of poetry he thought she might enjoy, fresh eggs from his ranch. Pearl found herself looking forward to his visits with an intensity that both thrilled and frightened her. She'd never experienced anything like the warmth that spread through her when Hayes was near, the way her pulse quickened at the sound of his voice. Word spread quickly through Silver Creek about Hayes Xavier's interest in the new dressmaker. Some, like Martha, seemed delighted. Others, like Beatrice Miller, were openly disapproving. It won't last, Pearl overheard Beatrice telling another woman at church one Sunday. Hayes Xavier could have any woman in the county. He's just being kind to the poor girl because she's making Martha's wedding dress. The words stung, echoing Pearl's own deepest fears. Why would someone like Hayes be interested in someone like her? He was handsome, respected, established in the community. She was an outsider, different in every way that mattered to a town like Silver Creek. Despite her doubts, Pearl couldn't deny the evidence of Hayes's growing affection. The way his eyes sought hers across a crowded room, the gentle brush of his hand against hers when they walked, the genuine interest he took in her work, asking questions and offering to build her a better workbench when he noticed her stooping over her current one. Martha's wedding was scheduled for early October, and as the date approached, Pearl spent long hours completing the gown. It was her finest work, ivory silk with delicate lace overlay, tiny pearl buttons down the back, and subtle embroidery along the bodice. The day before the wedding, Pearl delivered the finished dress to the Xavier Ranch, a sprawling property a few miles outside of town. Martha answered her knock, nearly pulling Pearl off her feet with an enthusiastic hug. It's finally here, Martha exclaimed, ushering Pearl inside. I've been counting the days. The ranch house was larger than Pearl had expected, with comfortable furnishings and large windows that let in the autumn sunlight. Martha led her to a bedroom where Pearl carefully unwrapped the dress. Martha's gasp of delight was everything Pearl had hoped for. Oh, Pearl, it's perfect. It's more beautiful than I imagined. Try it on, Pearl encouraged. We'll make sure everything fits just right. As Martha slipped into the gown, Pearl made small adjustments, pinning a section here, smoothing a seam there. When Martha finally stood before the mirror, tears welled in her eyes. I've never felt so beautiful, she whispered. You are beautiful, Pearl assured her, making one final adjustment to the skirt. Is that the wedding dress I've been hearing so much about? A deep voice asked from the doorway. Pearl looked up to see Hayes leaning against the doorframe, his expression one of genuine admiration as he looked at his sister. Hayes, what do you think? Martha twirled carefully. I think Daniel's a lucky man, Hayes replied, his gaze shifting to Pearl. You've created something remarkable, Pearl. Pearl felt herself blush under his praise. Martha made it easy. She knew exactly what she wanted. After making the final adjustments to Martha's dress, Pearl packed her supplies and prepared to leave. Hayes insisted on driving her back to town. I can't let you walk all that way with your heavy sewing basket, he said. Besides, I wanted to talk to you about something. In the wagon, Hayes seemed unusually quiet, his brow furrowed in thought. "Is everything all right?" Pearl finally asked. Hayes pulled the wagon to a stop on a rise overlooking his property. "I want to show you something." He helped her down from the wagon and led her to a clearing where the foundation of a building was taking shape. "What is this?" Pearl asked, curious. "A new house," Hayes replied, watching her reaction carefully. "The old ranch house is fine, but it's getting crowded with Martha and Daniel planning to stay on after the wedding. I thought it was time I had my own place." Pearl nodded, trying to ignore the pang she felt. Of course Hayes would want his own home eventually for when he married. Some lucky woman from a respectable family, no doubt. "It's a good location," she said, keeping her voice neutral. "The view is lovely." Hayes took her hand, his expression serious. "Pearl, I've been trying to find the right way to say this, and I'm not sure there is one, so I'm just going to speak plainly." Pearl's heart thudded painfully in her chest. "These past weeks with you have been the happiest I can remember," Hayes continued. "You're kind and talented and strong, and every day I find more things to admire about you. I know it might seem fast, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life." He took a deep breath. "I'm building this house with you in mind, Pearl, with us in mind. If you'd consider it, I'd like to court you properly with the intention of asking for your hand once we've had more time together." Pearl stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "You want to court me?" "With the intention of marriage," Hayes nodded, his expression earnest. "I do, very much." "But why?" The question escaped before Pearl could stop it. Hayes's brow furrowed. "Why wouldn't I? You're everything I've ever wanted in a partner." Pearl pulled her hand away, suddenly overwhelmed. "Hayes, you have to understand, people will talk, they already do. Someone like you with someone like me, it doesn't make sense to them." "Someone like me," Hayes repeated. "What does that mean?" "You know what I mean," Pearl said, her voice rising slightly. "You're Hayes Xavier. Your family has been here for generations. You own one of the largest ranches in the county. You could have any woman you wanted." "I want you," Hayes said simply. "But why?" Pearl demanded again, tears pricking at her eyes. "Is it pity? Because you've seen how people treat me?" Hayes's expression hardened. "Is that what you think of me? That I would court a woman out of pity?" "I don't know what to think," Pearl admitted. "All I know is that men like you don't usually look twice at women like me." "What kind of woman do you think you are, exactly?" Hayes asked, his voice gentle despite the hurt evident in his eyes. Pearl gestured helplessly at herself. "Look at me, Hayes. I'm not the kind of woman men write poems about. I'm too tall, too big. I take up too much space in a world where women are supposed to be dainty and delicate. I've heard it my whole life." Hayes was quiet for a long moment, his blue eyes studying her intently. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and fervent. "The people who told you those things were wrong, Pearl. Dead wrong." He stepped closer, taking her hands in his. "When I look at you, I see a woman who is exactly as she should be. Strong enough to start over in a new town alone. Talented enough to create beauty with just fabric and thread. Kind enough to befriend my sister when half the town was too busy gossiping to make her feel welcome." His thumbs traced circles on her palms. "As for taking up too much space, that's nonsense. You fill the perfect amount of space. You fill my thoughts. You fill the empty places in my life I didn't even know were there until I met you." Tears spilled onto Pearl's cheeks as Hayes continued, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "And as for being the kind of woman men write poems about," he smiled softly. "I've never been much for poetry, but I'd learn for you, Pearl Owens. I'd fill books with poems about the way your eyes light up when you talk about your work, or how your laugh makes everything around you seem brighter." Pearl couldn't speak, her heart too full for words. "I'm not asking for an answer today," Hayes said. Just the chance to show you how I feel. To court you properly if you'll let me." Pearl took a shaky breath. "People will talk. Let them," Hayes said firmly. "Their opinions don't matter to me, only yours does." Pearl looked up at the partially built house, then back at Hayes, allowing herself to imagine, just for a moment, a life with him. Morning coffee on a porch watching the sunrise, children running across the fields, coming home to someone who looked at her the way Hayes was looking at her now. "Yes," she said finally, her voice stronger. "Yes, I'll let you court me, Hayes Xavier." The smile that spread across Hayes's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "You've made me a very happy man, Pearl." He escorted her back to the wagon, his step lighter than before. As they drove back toward town, Pearl couldn't help but wonder what she was getting herself into, but for once, the uncertainty felt like the start of an adventure rather than a warning. Martha's wedding the next day was a joyous occasion. The small church in Silver Creek was decorated with autumn flowers and ribbons, and Martha was radiant in Pearl's creation. As the bride's brother, Hayes stood near the front, his eyes frequently finding Pearl's in the congregation. After the ceremony, a reception was held at the town hall. Pearl had worried about attending, knowing she would be under scrutiny as both the maker of the bride's dress and the object of Hayes Xavier's attentions. But Hayes stayed close by her side, proudly introducing her to relatives and friends from neighboring ranches. "This is Pearl Owens," he would say, "the most talented dressmaker in Colorado and the woman I'm courting." Each time he said it, Pearl felt a mix of embarrassment and pride. Embarrassment at being the center of attention, pride that Hayes claimed their relationship so openly. Not everyone was supportive. Pearl overheard whispers, saw the disapproving glances from some of the town's prominent women. Beatrice Miller was particularly vocal, cornering Hayes when Pearl stepped away briefly. "Really, Hayes, I understand wanting to be kind to the girl, but announcing that you're courting her. Think of your position in this community. Think of your family's name." Pearl froze just around the corner, unseen by either Beatrice or Hayes. "I've thought about it a great deal, Beatrice," Hayes replied, his voice cool. "And I've decided that the Xavier name will be just fine with Pearl Owens beside it. In fact, it will be better for it." "She doesn't fit here," Beatrice hissed. "She's too." "If you finish that sentence with any reference to Pearl's appearance," Hayes interrupted, "I'll remind you that my mother taught me to be a gentleman, but she also taught me to stand up to bullies." Pearl's heart swelled at his defense of her, even when he didn't know she could hear. "You'll regret this," Beatrice said, "when the novelty wears off and you're left with a wife no one respects." "The only thing I'd regret," Hayes said firmly, "is letting someone like you dictate who I should love. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to find Pearl. I promised her a dance." Pearl quickly moved away, not wanting to be caught eavesdropping. Hayes found her moments later, his smile returning as soon as he saw her. "Everything all right?" he asked, noting her flushed cheeks. "Perfect," Pearl replied, deciding not to mention what she'd overheard. "Though I could use some air. It's rather warm in here." Hayes offered his arm. "Let's step outside for a moment." The October evening was cool and crisp, stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Other couples were also taking advantage of the pleasant weather, strolling along the boardwalk or sitting on benches near the town hall. "You look beautiful tonight," Hayes said as they walked. "That blue suits you." Pearl smiled. "Thank you. I made it for Martha's wedding, hoping it would drum up business." "Has it? I've seen several ladies admiring your work today." "A few have asked about having dresses made," Pearl confirmed. "Mrs. Henderson even mentioned hosting a sewing circle at her home and inviting me to join." "That's wonderful," Hayes said, genuinely pleased for her. "See, they're starting to recognize your talent. Pearl nodded but couldn't help adding some of them anyway. Hayes sighed. Beatrice? Among others, Pearl admitted. I heard what she said to you, Hayes, about me not fitting in. Hayes stopped walking, turning to face her. You heard that? I didn't mean to eavesdrop, Pearl said quickly. I was coming back from the refreshment table and then you heard what I said to her, Hayes interrupted. And I meant every word, Pearl. Inside the town hall, the music had changed to a slower waltz, the notes drifting out to where they stood. Dance with me, Hayes asked, offering his hand. Here, now, right here, under the stars where it's just us. Pearl placed her hand in his, and Hayes drew her into a slow waltz, right there on the boardwalk. His hand at her waist was warm and steady, and he held her at a proper distance, but there was an intimacy to dancing alone under the night sky that made Pearl's heart race. I've been thinking, Hayes said as they moved to the music, about what you said yesterday about people talking. Pearl tensed slightly. Oh, you're right that they'll talk. People always do. But I want you to know that I've never cared less about what people think than I do right now, dancing with you. The music ended, but Hayes didn't release her hand. Instead, he raised it to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Pearl Owens, I'm falling in love with you, he said quietly, and I don't care who knows it. Pearl's breath caught in her throat. Hayes, you don't have to say anything, he assured her quickly. I just wanted you to know where I stand. I'm not ashamed of how I feel about you. I'm proud of it. Pearl studied his face in the moonlight, the sincerity in his eyes unmistakable. Gathering her courage, she squeezed his hand. I'm falling in love with you too, Hayes Xavier, and it terrifies me. His smile was brighter than the stars overhead. Being terrified together is better than being terrified alone, I reckon. Over the following weeks, Hayes courted Pearl with a determination that gradually silenced many of the whispers in Silver Creek. He took her on picnics along the creek that gave the town its name, escorted her to church on Sundays, and spent evenings on her porch talking until the stars were bright overhead. Pearl's dressmaking business began to thrive as well. Martha's wedding dress had indeed been the best advertisement she could have hoped for, and even some of the women who had initially been cool toward her began to request her services. Hayes continued work on the new house, sometimes bringing Pearl to see the progress. It was taking shape nicely, a 2-story home with plenty of windows to let in light, and a wide porch that wrapped around 2 sides. What do you think of having your sewing room here? Hayes asked one afternoon, showing her a bright corner room with windows facing east and south. The light would be good most of the day. Pearl's heart fluttered at how easily Hayes included her in his plans for the house. It would be perfect for sewing, she agreed. As they walked through the partially completed rooms, Hayes pointed out features he'd included with her in mind: higher counters in the kitchen, because of her height, a deep bathtub, bookshelves for her collection of fashion magazines and patterns. You've thought of everything, Pearl said, deeply touched by his consideration. I want it to feel like your home, Hayes replied simply. Our home, eventually, if you'll have me. As autumn deepened toward winter, the courting couple established routines that brought them closer. Sunday dinners at the Xavier Ranch with Martha and Daniel. Wednesday evenings at Pearl's cottage, where Hayes would read aloud while Pearl worked on her sewing. Saturday afternoons exploring the countryside around Silver Creek, Hayes teaching Pearl to ride so they could cover more ground. It was on one such ride in late November that Hayes took Pearl to a secluded valley on the far edge of his property. This is beautiful, Pearl said, surveying the sheltered spot where a small stream ran through a meadow bordered by pine trees. I've never been to this part of your ranch before. I've been saving it, Hayes admitted, helping her dismount. He spread a blanket under a large pine and unpacked a simple picnic lunch from his saddlebags. As they ate, Hayes seemed uncharacteristically nervous, fidgeting with his hat and starting sentences only to abandon them halfway through. "Hayes, is something wrong?" Pearl finally asked. "No," he said quickly. "Nothing's wrong. Everything's right, actually. That's why I brought you here today." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. Pearl's heart began to pound as he moved to kneel before her on the blanket. "Pearl Owens," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "These past months have been the happiest of my life. You've brought joy and beauty and purpose into my world in ways I never expected. I know we haven't known each other long by some standards, but I've never been more certain of anything than I am of my love for you." He opened the box to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a pearl surrounded by small diamonds. "This was my grandmother's. My mother always said it should go to the woman who captured my heart completely." His blue eyes held hers intently. "Will you marry me, Pearl? Will you build a life with me, here on this land?" Pearl's vision blurred with tears as she looked from the ring to Hayes's hopeful face. Despite all the progress they'd made in town, despite Hayes's unwavering support, a small voice in the back of her mind still whispered doubts. "Hayes, are you certain? Being with me won't be easy." "There will always be people who, I've never been more certain of anything," Hayes interrupted gently. "And being with you is the easiest decision I've ever made. I love you, Pearl, all of you, exactly as you are." Pearl took a shaky breath, her heart full to bursting. "Then yes. Yes, I'll marry you, Hayes Xavier." Hayes's face lit up with joy as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. He gathered her into his arms, holding her close. "May I kiss you?" he asked, his voice low. In answer, Pearl leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, then deepened as Hayes pulled her closer, one hand cradling the back of her head while the other rested at her waist. When they finally parted, both breathless, Hayes rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Pearl Owens, soon to be Pearl Xavier." "I love you too," she whispered, marveling at how right it felt to be in his arms. They returned to town late that afternoon, Pearl's new ring catching the light as they rode side by side. By unspoken agreement, they stopped first at the Xavier Ranch to share their news with Martha and Daniel, who were overjoyed. "I knew it from the first time I saw you two together," Martha exclaimed, hugging Pearl tightly. "Welcome to the family officially." In town, the news spread quickly. Many offered genuine congratulations. Some, predictably, were less enthusiastic. Beatrice Miller made a point of expressing her concern about the hasty engagement to anyone who would listen, but Pearl found that the whispers bothered her less now. Hayes's love had given her a confidence she'd never possessed before, not because he validated her worth, but because he saw it so clearly that she could no longer deny it herself. Winter arrived with a vengeance in December, bringing heavy snow that temporarily halted work on Hayes's new house. The wedding was planned for April, when the weather would be more reliable and the house would be completed. Pearl threw herself into creating her own wedding dress, working on it during the long winter evenings when snow kept Hayes from visiting as frequently as he would have liked. She chose ivory silk, similar to Martha's dress, but with a design uniquely her own, clean lines that accentuated rather than disguised her figure, with delicate embroidery that told the story of their courtship in subtle symbols. A pine tree for their engagement spot, a tiny horse for their rides together, wildflowers like the ones Hayes often brought her. When he could visit, Hayes would sit by her fire, discussing plans for their future crops they might grow, improvements to the ranch's operation, children they hoped to have someday. I was thinking we might expand into breeding horses as well as cattle, Hayes said one evening in January. There's good money in it if done right, and that valley where I proposed would be perfect for grazing. I know nothing about horses beyond what you've taught me, Pearl admitted, but I'm willing to learn, Hayes smiled. That's all I can ask. And I'm hoping you'll continue your dressmaking after we're married. You have a gift that shouldn't go to waste. Pearl looked up from her embroidery, touched by his support. You wouldn't mind. Some men expect their wives to focus solely on the home. I'm not some men, Hayes replied simply. I fell in love with you as you are, Pearl. I'd never ask you to be less than that. As winter slowly loosened its grip on Silver Creek, work resumed on the house. Hayes insisted that Pearl have input on every decision, from the color of paint in each room to the placement of furniture. It's going to be your home too, he reminded her when she protested that she didn't know anything about building houses. Our home, Pearl corrected, smiling. By late March, the house was nearly complete, and Pearl had begun moving some of her things from the cottage in town. Her wedding dress hung in Martha's spare bedroom, safely away from Hayes's curious eyes. It's bad luck for the groom to see the dress before the wedding, Martha insisted when Hayes complained about the secrecy. I don't believe in that superstition, Hayes grumbled. Well, I do, Pearl said firmly, and you'll just have to wait until our wedding day. The wedding was planned for the first Saturday in April. As the day approached, Pearl found herself growing increasingly nervous not about marrying Hayes, but about being the center of attention at such a public event. What if I trip walking down the aisle? She fretted to Martha the day before the wedding. Or what if my dress doesn't look right? Or Pearl, Martha interrupted gently, Hayes wouldn't care if you walked down the aisle in a potato sack. He loves you, that's all that matters tomorrow. Pearl took a deep breath. You're right. I know you're right. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and mild, as if nature itself approved of the union. Pearl woke early in Martha's guest room, where she'd spent the night in keeping with tradition. Martha helped her dress, carefully fastening each of the tiny pearl buttons down the back of the wedding gown. When Pearl finally stood before the mirror, she barely recognized herself. The dress fit perfectly, highlighting her curves rather than hiding them. Her auburn hair was arranged in soft waves, adorned with small white flowers, and her cheeks were flushed with excitement. You're the most beautiful bride I've ever seen, Martha said, tears in her eyes. Hayes is going to be speechless. At the small church, it seemed the entire town had turned out for the wedding. Pearl waited in a side room, her father's Bible clutched in her hands, wishing desperately that her parents could have been there to see her happiness. There was a soft knock at the door, and Daniel, Hayes's soon-to-be brother-in-law, poked his head in. It's time, Pearl. Are you ready? Pearl nodded, taking a deep breath. I'm ready. The church had been decorated with early spring flowers and greenery. As the pianist began playing, Pearl took Daniel's arm he had offered to escort her down the aisle in her father's absence and stepped into the church. The assembled guests rose, turning to watch her entrance. Pearl kept her eyes fixed on Hayes, who stood at the altar, his expression one of wonder and love as he saw her for the first time in her wedding dress. As she reached him, Hayes took her hands in his eyes never leaving her face. You are so beautiful, he whispered, so only she could hear. The minister began the ceremony, but Pearl barely registered his words. All she could focus on was Hayes, the warmth of his hands holding hers, the love in his eyes as he recited his vows. I, Hayes Xavier, take you, Pearl Elizabeth Owens, to be my lawfully wedded wife. To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part. When it was her turn, Pearl's voice was clear and strong, her earlier nervousness forgotten. "I, Pearl Elizabeth Owens, take you, Hayes Xavier, to be my lawfully wedded husband." They exchanged rings, a simple gold band for Hayes, and a wedding band that matched her engagement ring for Pearl. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Hayes didn't wait for permission to kiss his bride. He gathered her gently in his arms and kissed her with such tenderness that several guests were seen wiping away tears. "Mrs. Xavier," he murmured against her lips. "Mr. Xavier," she replied with a smile. The reception was held at the completed new house, which many of the guests were seeing for the first time. Pearl had worked tirelessly with Martha to prepare the home for this day, arranging furniture, hanging curtains, making sure everything was perfect. As Hayes led her across the threshold for the first time as his wife, he paused in the entryway. "Welcome home, Pearl Xavier." The words sent a thrill through her. Home. After so many years of feeling out of place, she had found where she belonged, not just in this house, but with this man. The celebration lasted well into the evening, with music and dancing and more food than their guests could possibly consume. Even Beatrice Miller offered stiff congratulations, though Pearl noticed she didn't stay long. As the last guests were leaving, Hayes found Pearl on the porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and pink. "Happy?" he asked, slipping an arm around her waist. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied honestly. Later that night, after everyone had gone and they were truly alone in their new home for the first time, Hayes built a fire in their bedroom fireplace while Pearl changed out of her wedding dress. She had sewn a special nightgown for this night, one that made her feel beautiful rather than self-conscious. When she emerged from the dressing room, Hayes turned from the fire, his breath catching audibly. "Pearl," he said, his voice low and reverent, "you are so beautiful." Pearl came to him, still somewhat shy despite the months of courtship. "You make me feel beautiful." Hayes took her hands in his, raising them to his lips. "You were beautiful long before I came along. I'm just the lucky man who gets to remind you of it every day for the rest of our lives." He drew her gently into his arms, kissing her with increasing passion. His hands moved to her waist, then hesitated. "I don't want to rush you," he murmured against her lips. Pearl smiled, her earlier nervousness fading in the warmth of his embrace. "We have all night," she whispered. "And all the nights after this one." Hayes lifted her into his arms then, carrying her to their bed as if she weighed nothing at all. As he laid her gently on the coverlet, his eyes roamed over her with undisguised adoration. "You know what I thought the first time I held your hand?" he asked, stretching out beside her. Pearl shook her head. "I thought how perfectly it fit in mine," he said, taking her hand and interlacing their fingers. "And then I thought the same thing when I held your waist when we danced." His hand moved to her waist now, spanning it easily. "And I knew then what I know with even more certainty now." His voice dropped lower, his blue eyes darkening with desire. "You were made for me, Pearl Xavier. You fit perfectly in my hands, in my arms, in my life." Pearl's heart swelled with emotion as Hayes leaned down to kiss her, his touch both gentle and insistent. In his arms, she felt neither too big nor too small, but exactly, perfectly right. In the warm glow of the firelight, Hayes showed her with his hands and lips and whispered words of love exactly how perfect he found every inch of her. And Pearl, who had spent a lifetime believing her body was somehow wrong, discovered the joy of being cherished exactly as she was. Later, as they lay tangled together beneath the covers, Hayes's arm draped protectively across her waist, Pearl marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the lonely, mocked newcomer to the cherished wife of the man she loved in less than a year. "What are you thinking about?" Hayes asked sleepily, pressing a kiss to her shoulder. "About how lucky I am," Pearl replied, "to have found you, to be here." Hayes pulled her closer. "I'm the lucky one, Pearl, never doubt that." As spring blossomed into summer, the Xavier Ranch thrived under the care of its expanded family. Pearl divided her time between helping with ranch operations and continuing her dressmaking business, which had grown to include clients from neighboring towns who had heard of her skill with a needle. Hayes had converted a sunny room in their house into a proper workshop for her, complete with built-in storage for fabrics, and a custom-made cutting table that was the perfect height for Pearl's tall frame. "Now you won't have to stoop over your work," he said proudly when he first showed her the completed space. Life as Mrs. Hayes Xavier was not without its challenges. There were still those in town who whispered when Pearl passed, and occasionally she overheard comments about Hayes settling for her. But with each passing month, as the couple's happiness remained evident to all who saw them, the whispers grew fewer. By their first anniversary, Pearl was expecting their first child, her body changing in ways that initially brought back old insecurities. But Hayes's adoration never wavered. If anything, he seemed to find her more beautiful as she carried their child. "You're glowing," he would tell her, his hands gently cradling her growing belly. "I've never seen anything more beautiful than you carrying our baby." When their son was born in early December, a healthy boy they named Henry Michael Xavier. After both their fathers, Pearl felt a completeness she hadn't known was possible. Watching Hayes hold their son for the first time, his strong hands so gentle with the tiny infant, she knew with absolute certainty that she had found her place in the world. "He has your eyes," Hayes said, looking up at Pearl with wonder. "Those beautiful green eyes." "And your stubborn chin," Pearl replied with a tired smile. As Henry grew, so did the Xavier family's prosperity. Hayes's idea of breeding horses proved successful, and Pearl's dressmaking business continued to flourish. By their 5th anniversary, they had added a daughter to their family, Martha Elizabeth, named for Hayes's sister and Pearl's mother. On a warm summer evening 10 years after they first met, Pearl sat on their porch swing, watching Hayes teach 7-year-old Henry to throw a lasso while 5-year-old Martha picked wildflowers nearby. The setting sun cast a golden glow over the scene, and Pearl's heart swelled with contentment. Hayes looked up and caught her watching, his smile as warm as it had been that day in the mercantile when he'd first helped her with fallen cans. He said something to Henry, and then walked toward the porch, still moving with the same easy grace that had first caught her attention. "What are you thinking about, Mrs. Xavier?" he asked, sitting beside her on the swing. "How different my life might have been if I hadn't come to Silver Creek," Pearl replied. "If I hadn't been brave enough to start over here." Hayes took her hand, his thumb tracing the wedding band he'd placed there a decade ago. "I'm mighty glad you were brave," he said. "I can't imagine my life without you in it." Pearl leaned against his shoulder, watching their children play in the yard of the home they had built together. "Neither can I." Hayes pressed a kiss to her temple. "You know what I was thinking earlier today?" "What's that?" "That after 10 years you still fit perfectly in my arms." His voice held the same warmth and certainty it had on their wedding night. "You always will, Pearl Xavier, always." As the first stars appeared in the twilight sky, Pearl knew the truth of his words in the depths of her soul. In Hayes's love, in the family they had created together, in the community that had eventually embraced them both, she had found the perfect fit, not despite who she was, but because of it. And in that knowledge, she had found home,